everyone. Please go ahead and get seated. We are about to get started on our final panel of the symposium, Games in the Academy. So I'm going to introduce my blue-haired companion, Patrick Jagoda, and I'm going to read this whole thing. It's very, and I'm going to. It's really great. So I am introducing our moderator for this lovely panel. This is Patrick Jagoda, William Rainey Harper Professor in the Department of English and Cinema Media Studies here at the University of Chicago. Patrick specializes in media theory, game studies and design, science studies, and 20th and 21st century American literature and culture. He is the faculty director of the Weston Game Lab and the director of the Media Arts Design program here at the university. And if we can have a round of applause for Patrick, and he will introduce the rest of the course.
Thank you very much, Ashlyn. We're going to talk a little bit about the bullshit of academia in a second, so that was perfect with like the title and all. It's all good. So before we start, I just really wanted, because this may be the last occasion as people file in and out, I just wanted to thank some of our volunteers without whom this wouldn't have been possible. A lot of the back end stuff, the meals, the questions, routing people in and out has been done by these undergraduates, graduate students, staff, and many others who gave up their weekends to be here with us. I'm really grateful for that. So those people include Atticus Yang, Ethan Warner, Chelsea Kaufman, Zach Yost, Sophia Wetzel, Deb Warner, Angela Solis, Claudia Cunnings, David Farley, Rachel Rosenberg, Miles Cross, Sarah Whitney, Ella Donahue, Hanushad Puri, Hang Wu, Madeline Engler, Kaylin Doyle-Myerskoff, Zi Lin, Jen Uchi, Taylor Pate, Langi Ren, David Hall, Connor Sullivan, and also Kate Petit, who helped organize this group very importantly at the MAD Center. Thank you to all of them, just tremendous work throughout the weekend. I also wanted to throw out a special thanks to Ben Chandler, Frank Gilbert, and the Logan Center team, as well as Bill Michael, for all the amazing work planning this event also and executing it so well. I'm going to thank a couple more people at the very end, but I just wanted to start there. And now on to the Academy and the fun. So I'm going to very briefly introduce the group of people sitting right next to me. And I have to say, like, we've had a lot of like fan moments around creators of video games, including recognizable video games throughout the weekend. But I have to say, in addition to being a fan of those folks, I'm a fan of these folks. And like, I wouldn't be thinking half the stuff that I'm thinking or doing what I'm doing without their work, both their writing and their game making. So I'm gonna have like a fangirl moment throughout this whole thing. So games in the Academy. So first of all, like, we have a wide-ranging group of people here, right? We have cultural theorists who analyze games across subfields like playable theater and indigenous studies. We have game designers who create art games and independent games. We have game-based researchers who use games to answer social scientific questions. And importantly, we also have a group of people who teach courses about games, like what a perverse thing to do, at top US universities. So we'll talk a little bit about pedagogy, laboratory spaces, things like that. Super briefly, and I'm mostly doing this so you can get some initial visuals. I'll be very brief. Again, you could look these folks up, and they're longer productions. So first we have Jodi Byrd, who's professor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. So I'm fortunate to have them as one of my colleagues in the MAD program as well, where they recently taught a course on race and indigeneity in video games. Next, we have Fox Harrell, who's also on the last panel. That's true of the next three folks, who's a professor of digital media and artificial intelligence at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT. He teaches courses in media studies, phantasmal media, and social aspects of game design. Next, we have Mitu Khandaker, Associate Arts Professor at the NYU Tisch School of Arts and an active game designer in the Game Center. I know we have some folks from there here. She teaches courses in programming for games, game studies, and game design. Next we have Celia Pearce, who's professor of art and design at Northeastern University and the co-founder of the Indiecade Game Festival. She teaches courses in experimental game design, designing imaginary worlds, social science, and game studies. And clearly, because I'm incapable of multitasking, you've gotten Jodi's stuff, but you haven't gotten Fox's amazing stuff, which we will go back to over time. But these are just some impressions of some of the tabletop storytelling work that we'll come back to. And then finally, we have Eddo Stern, who's professor of design media arts at UCLA, the founder of the UCLA Game Lab as well. There's a t-shirt there, hopefully for sale somewhere. He teaches courses in both game design and game studies, including a course that's focused on a single analog game, backgammon, which I hope at some point we'll get into as well. Okay, so for the first question, let's start in the guts of perversity. It seems really weird that we do stuff related to games at universities, including top US universities. These are complex systems that include various corporate and donor interests, the various histories of the university, and then also the specific game industry and the ways it does and does not intersect with what it is that we do. And I was talking to Eddo, and we felt these tensions yesterday. Those tensions aren't all bad, right? But there are differences in how we talk about games, why we want to talk about games. So I just want to start to think a little bit about how you think about this fundamental question of games being in the university. How has that informed how you've come to this at your institutions? Yeah, can we use mics just for?
Yeah, because I've been there since the very beginning. So what I wanted to start by saying is that I worked on the USC master's program in games and interactive media, and we started working on it in 1998 or 1999, and we were the pariah of the film department. They didn't want us there. There were people that were actively trying to get rid of us. They didn't want a degree. It was just this whole nonsense. And frankly, I've dealt with this again since then, weirdly. There is a way in which academia really rejects games in many ways. But the thing that I took then and I continue to take now is all of the classes we taught were over-enrolled. And so I always think, well, they may fight us now, but we're going to win in the end because of you, because of the students and the people coming up who want to be part of this. Rant's done.
This is a panel in which I encourage rants and polemics. Great way to end the conference.
I guess for me, so I did my PhD at the University of Portsmouth in the UK, and it was a new department at that point. So I was the first, the first or second. There were two PhD students that were part of the part of this new department that was spun up, which was one of the stories that we see often of sort of interdisciplinary comp sci people, humanities people, kind of thrown together. And that was an interesting environment because I was as at the same time as being a PhD student embarking on my research on sort of looking at how immersive interfaces change the way we play. I was also teaching, TAing for this new undergrad program they had there in game development. So I was oh, this is cool. This is the education I didn't get because I did computer engineering as my sort of undergrad degree. So it was kind of cool to it was interesting to sort of start there, but then to sort of counter that with going to the Game Center, the NYU Game Center, where, and my story getting to there was that I did my PhD, I took a break from it because I was just no, I need to go make this indie game, I'm gonna take a break from my PhD. Make this indie game, because it's in my head and I need to get it out into the world. And then, went back, finished my doctorate, and then, ended up in 2015 joining the NYU Game Center, where I was oh, this is, the thing that was so interesting about that, and I think continues to be It's just like, it's rooted in the idea of game design, like purely game design, and again, game design in an art school context. And that's the one thing that I've just really enjoyed in my sort of last 10 years there, being someone who came from this sort of, primarily engineering background, who had to sort of wrest themselves into humanities-esque thinking to do my PhD, and then, I just think about the things I make sort of naturally. So for me, the game center felt like home immediately. I think, the thing about teaching, I'm sure this is going to be true of everybody as well. We just think of games as a continuation of culture, right? And we don't make that distinction so much between digital games and analog games. It's all about sort of the ways in which humans have historically just engaged with play and the ways that we've told our stories through play. That's the context in which we approach everything. Let's understand these things and how we make them, and let's be really thoughtful and intentional about the ways we make these things.
I'll say something too, just because NYU's Tisch School of the Arts had something to do with that, the path. So the question is, why games within academia for me? So I can start maybe just further back, because I like games and video games. Of course, growing up, I didn't really have a term like gamer, because just as much. I played punk rock music with my friend, played bass, skateboarded, did a lot of other kinds of things too. But I like games enough that I worked at a flea market for a summer when I saw, there's a system called a PC Engine that has a game based on the anime Macross. I'll work the entire summer just for that. And so, so bought this kind of obscure system. But that was really, I guess, more driven by being an early adopter of anime in some ways. And what I really was interested in at that point was that I like writing, fiction and poetry. I enjoyed playing music, enjoyed programming. It's really interested in AI, and I kind of read about it on my own. I guess in one of those skateboarding adventures, I grew up in San Diego. At the university there, I saw a sign that special interest group in AI. I could go there, and I went, and it was just a lot of much older engineers, they give me cookies and talk about fuzzy logic and things like that. I just, but I was interested in integrating all those things. I kept thinking, how can I do this? And I just had this kind of naive idea that is, whatever comes after TV, I want to be kind of a force for things that could be good and beautiful in that. And it probably would have something to do with the computer, maybe interactive. And that was in junior high school. So when I went to college, it wasn't games. In fact, I played one game in college, and that wasn't until my fourth year. In terms of video games, and it's because I was just interested in things like AI and art, and what could be new forms of storytelling. Could I use AI to tell a story differently each time in terms of cultural perspective or metaphor or theme? Maybe the plot is fixed. And I was really interested in those sort of things. I was learning from really experimental cinema and the arts. I was both in art and logic and computation. So I was really in that kind of space. And so games I enjoyed, but it wasn't really that integrated with the topic of research. And we talked about a lot of new forms. It included VR, immersive media, interactive narrative, interactive cinema. But when I was in that program at NYU, and a couple of courses in game design and interactive narrative were entirely off the computer, it was all analog. And one of the things that I liked about the way that they taught about this topic, and in some way I guess they're peers now, Frank Lantz, Eric Zimmerman, people like this, and what is that they thought about games not just those video games that I knew as growing up, but it was also we talk, one of the things they would say was why do we talk about games like there's gamers and then there's not gamers? Because we don't do the same thing with music. We don't say there's musicers and not non-musicers, right? It's what kind of music do you like? And it's what kind of game do you like? And actually at that time, my mom, who never played games growing up, found out because she really liked medical dramas, like, wait, there's this DS game with a stylus where I can like suture people, things like that. So she had me get that game, and then she liked it. And then she's like, can you find me this obscure lawyer game, Ace Attorney? It's out of print right now, but like I'll find it on eBay. And so I did. And like now, you know, like Celia mentioned about like older gamers, she's telling me like, well, there's a streamer I've been watching, like does Animal Crossing and Breath of the Wild, and all this. And like, by the way, she's also an opera singer who's going to be singing in Boston this week. Like, I don't watch any streamers like that, you know, but yeah, so it's like, you know, so anyway, she's much more like, maybe gamer, you know, than me, but I love that idea. And I also began thinking, like, for interactive narrative, it's not hypertext fiction, it's not all these other things that are like the most popular and used form of interactive narrative, it's games. And so I just am like, what if I can do these things I'm interested in and just use all the affordances of games to do it? And now that was around like 2000 or so. And so since then, it's just been like a part of that integrated inquiry. Like it was already there, like I said, already was interested enough to like sell sunglasses for a summer, you know, but yeah, but it was a chance where I could think like, okay, let me just really integrate, you know, like all of this, and it just became intrinsic to these forms of combining like AI and storytelling and culture and activism, you know, for me. And it's one that was really most recognizable in some way for a lot of people. So anyway, that's like sort of my path towards integrating games into what I do for the last like 25 years or so in terms of research.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, this integration story, I think, relates to my inevitability in games. I've always been interested in too many things. Had a very interesting and hard time in undergrad to figure out what to major in. I ended up doing like 3 different majors, so one in like computation, one in arts, one in theory. I never wanted to let go of any of those. And then it's very hard in academia, kind of with this push to track and the structures that are already in place. So, you know, I went to art school, so I'm an artist, I think, in my framing of how most of what I do. But actually funny, Celia, I should give Celia props. Celia hired me for my first teaching gig when I was a student in grad school to teach at USC. So like, I think like 2 weeks after I graduated, I was teaching other grad students things, so that was very fun. But what was I gonna say? So I teach at UCLA. I taught at CalArts before that. And at CalArts, it was an interesting journey as well. I taught in a bunch of different departments. I taught in the theater department, in the art department, in critical studies, and in the film and animation department, all separate appointments at different, so it's not even like, it was just like, this person wants, so my view on games is very, I mean, I think a lot of people have a broad view, but I like to think of them as just ever expanding and unbounded and unlimited. I feel like academia, in a weird, ironic way, for me, has allowed that to happen. I feel fairly free to treat games as an undisciplined discipline. I know I'll be a little critical, like a lot of institutions I think have, this is very, so, have kind of traded away, I think, the part of the responsibility and mission of the university as a place to do things that can't be done in other places. So being experimental, everyone uses that word, but what does that really mean? I think once academia is subservient to industry and is mirroring and training the pipelines of production that are already in place, they've already been honed and streamlined by other needs, that's a misuse of the resource of academia. And that's like a position I hold very strongly. Now, I'm the chair of the department now. I've written our grad curriculum and our undergrad curriculum. And I engage a lot with the university at large now at UCLA, and I understand better, I won't do a long lecture, but I understand better kind of what the university is for. And you know, one framework is it serves, let's say on the student side, three goals. Undergraduate education, which is a particular thing. It already training people to go into the workforce, but also training them to be good citizens. People who can make informed decisions in a democracy or not. So undergrad education, very particular role that games education has in that. The other is professional education at the grad level as well, training people to go into the workforce, like MD, JD, MBA, and MFA, unfortunately, is also a professional program in our school and others, and that's one of the problems. And then you have research, which again is PhDs, MAs, some MFAs, which is maybe the most exciting thing about academia as an academic, not as a student perhaps. You get to do other things that don't quite fit those other models. So I think that is important to me. And the question is then, well, what kind of research would you do as a games person that is different than what happens elsewhere? And I think that's really what I think about all the time. What can we do? What can I do that I can't do in industry, I can't do in other academic disciplines that will force me to do, like educational games, serious games, social science games, technology research, but something else than all of that. So the last thing I'd say is I taught at CalArts. I was hired by the president of CalArts to start a games school at CalArts. Really exciting. And I fought very hard for 2 years to not have it fall under another school. So it was to start a program, and it was like, well, we have this school, it could be here, film, it could be art. And I was like, no, it has to be its own, the 9th school at CalArts. And I fought hard, it got close, didn't work out. I took a job at UCLA, and I was like, I have to work in that way. So I started the lab, the UCLA Game Lab, as a gray ops operation, I call it. It is sort of it's sort of extracurricular in its origins and allows that kind of autonomy. So I'm a big believer in that, fighting for autonomy in a field like this, rather than, I think, falling into the structures that are there for funding that will push you and allow you to do things that the institution already wants you to do. So I'm a big believer in that kind of renegade mode of game experimentation. So.
I'm not going to go, I know it's your turn, but I don't want to go into a whole long origin story because that will take hours and hours on end. But I actually don't have any kind of academic trajectory. I actually started teaching game design with no degrees when I started at USC. And I was kind of a refugee of industry. As a consultant, I worked in the theme park industry, and I had this epiphany where somebody on a panel at the IAPA conference, if anyone knows what that is, it's a theme park conference. I was on a visionaries panel, and somebody asked me what was the biggest barrier between me and the visions that I have for theme park attractions, and I, without even skipping a beat, said, my clients. And after that, I was like, yeah, I got to do something about this situation. And so part of what gravitated me towards academia was I was going to SIGGRAPH in the late 90s and seeing all this amazing VR work, much of which was being done by women. And I thought, wow, these guys get to do whatever they want. And that really excited me, was the opportunity to just do crazy things that didn't have an ROI associated with them. So I think that's also kind of another flip side. And as you were talking about focusing on career development, that's what's called a trade school. So whenever we get into these arguments, I always say, okay, that's great, that's a trade school. We're a university, and we're interdisciplinary, and we have humanities, and we have all these other disciplines. If people want to go to DigiPen, that's great, but that's not what a university is for.
Hi, I'm usually introduce myself as a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm two-spirit, non-binary. I come to video games kind of differently. I'm the critic, maybe on the panel, so I don't do any design. And I come through Indigenous studies first. And what's interesting to me and about the intersections in academia for video game studies and Indigenous studies is in part that they kind of come up at the same time. Indigenous studies is a whole discipline that exists outside of academia for, a millennia, but it's institutionalized in the 1970s. You can sort of see a similar parallel but Indians are always assumed to be kind of pre-time, or at least 19th century, where video games end up being kind of cutting edge always. And so I'm interested in that juxtaposition, the uneasiness of it. And so my other thought about academia, how political can I actually get here? My book is behind me, so Structures of Dispossession. Academia for me is entirely a structure of dispossession. And so I sort of do a Rogue One garbage chute approach to what I'm here for, which is to steal what you can and create opportunities and entry points for something. And what that meant, where I started video game studies for myself, and maybe at least an attempt at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, involved me going into the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, which is a hilarious story that I write about in the book, but I don't have to necessarily say all the things here. But it was also in the occasion of having a national controversy about a colleague that we had hired into American Indian Studies, a Palestinian scholar getting fired. And so there was, for tweets in 2014. So it created an opportunity for the institution to destroy an American Indian Studies program, but then try to retain faculty that they didn't want to lose. And so I asked for certain things like a gaming classroom. And so I tried to set up places to put classes together. And I was starting at that point to teach classes on race and indigeneity there, but also gender in gaming. I made Fox News and Friends in 2019. The class that beat me out was a class at Northwestern called Unsettling Whiteness. But they actually, the kid who created the report actually tried to show up on Fox News and said, how dare an English department, which is the department I was in at that point, how dare they offer a class in video games? It's not literary. And there was like a hot second where he tried to generate outrage and it just didn't go anywhere, right? Because industry, there's a whole lot of reasons why you would teach video games in English classes. So that's at least a way that I come into this question about academia.
Thank you all for those answers. I'm gonna, for the next questions, feel free to answer or not. We can just kind of jump around through a few. But I wanted to follow up on a thread that several of you have brought up already, which is kind of like theory and practice, essentially, right? Like when you look at, say, English departments, like many people on the literary studies side aren't also creative writers. Sure, there are like poetry and poetics people that I think are exceptions at some places, but certainly like there aren't many art historians who are also like serious visual artists, for instance. And yet in game studies, I think you do see a little bit more of that hybridity and these kinds of interactions between theorists and designers and a real openness, right? I actually find in a lot of like literary studies departments, like the critics don't talk to the makers that often, whereas I think even those of us on the theory side do, and vice versa. So I'd love for you all, whoever wants to, like, to reflect a little bit more about like why that might be in game studies as a field, or game design as an orientation at the university, and also like what's maybe like one thing that you've been able to see by both writing about games and then making games, and moving back and forth across that line and across these kinds of hybrid conversations. So anybody who wants to get us started.
I think that critical making is really important. And I mentioned, I'll just sort of, this is a segue to one of my slides. So there's a slide in there that starts with DAC in 2001, which is the conference Fox was talking about in the last session. So in 1998, the Digital Arts and Cultures Conference started, and this was kind of the first digital literary theory community of academics talking about games and game-related and digital media. And DIGRA, the Digital Games Research Association, is like, basically DAC is the godmother of DIGRA. Most people don't even know that DIGRA exists, that DAC exists, but that's where it started. And it was mostly humanities scholars who were interested in doing game criticism, and some of them were also, like Fox, making digital literature of various kinds. But one of the things that frustrated me very early on about this, and I wasn't even really an academic yet at this point, was the uncriticality with which a lot of the scholars would talk about these games. What they were was sort of glorified fanboys, and they would just go, oh, this is so amazing, and I'm going to write about it, but they wouldn't critique, for example, the lack of gender equity or the lack of racial equity or whatever the flaws were in the medium. They couldn't see them. They thought everything was great about them, and they just sort of took the corporate product and swallowed it whole and then sort of regurgitated their genre criticism, a lot of which was quite obsessed with the mechanics of computing as a literary criticism problem, not the screen, not the content, right? So that was something that actually got my Irish up a bit and got me writing essentially what was at the time critical theory writing, even though I didn't consider myself that kind of person at all, but I was just like, hey guys, wake up, you know, and eventually sort of got zombied into an academic by just getting invited to do things. But I just wanted to mention that because that is one of the things that motivated me was the lack of criticality in academia. And I also wanted to mention, I'm trying to find a way to work this in, but I'll just put it here. So I think it's really important for video game students to study things other than video games. And students who find their inspiration only from video games are gonna make bad games that are like all the other games they've ever played. And the reason the plug I'm pushing in here is last week, one of my students came to my class after the long weekend and told me that he had gone to see the the Man Ray exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, or I'm sorry, at the Met Museum because of my class. And I thought, this is great. This kid would never even have known who Man Ray was without taking my class that uses art to teach game design. And so the plug is, yesterday, they opened a Yoko Ono show at the Museum of Contemporary Art here, which if I wasn't flying out of here tonight, I would go to in a hot minute. All of you game design students, she is my favorite game designer. I'll just say it, Yoko Ono is my favorite game designer. So these kind of broader references and the knowledge that we bring from these other disciplines. And when I was first at USC, I was talking to Eddo about this the other day, I was making kids in my design class read Understanding Media. And I got yelled at by the critical studies faculty because they said, this is a production class. You're not supposed to ask the students to read. No, and ever since then I've resisted this bifurcation of the two because I think they're really important for them to go hand in hand.
Other thoughts about theory and practice?
Sorry. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about theory and practice. As you know, if you were in the last session, you got a lot of insight into the work that I do as a game maker. And honestly, I've been lucky enough to have that practice because of the nature of my role at NYU Game Center. We myself and all of my fellow faculty, we have a strong mandate to be creative practitioners, professional practitioners in the field, which is the thing that I really love because it's given rise to blow up games would not have happened if it wasn't for that, right? Because I wouldn't have been able to necessarily take the risk of starting a game studio, right? Full disclosure, I paid a lot of people throughout the four years we ran. I never paid myself, because that money could be used to pay somebody else, right? So that's a consideration in terms of these things, these types of risks that we can take and how we can sort of finance things. But yeah, so yes, I have, I've definitely approached it that way in terms of what can I do out in the world as somebody who has the ability to sort of take those risks, but then also I think just kind of like Celia was saying, feel like critical inquiry and thinking is just a part of my design practice in general. I can't necessarily separate the two, and I think that's what we want to instill in all of our students to be better designers. And I completely agree with Celia on pushing them beyond just regurgitating existing things from games and pushing them into things beyond games and other forms of art and media, etc. The other thing I'll say around those two things, you saw as well, if you're in the previous session, my new experimental autobiographical narrative project that I'm working on. That's in part, just as of last week, that's in part going to be supported a little bit by the university in terms of just helping me get a research assistant to help me have accountability for working on it week on week, right? So yeah, I think that's one lens on that. I think the other the final thing I wanted to say about sort of theory and practice, we also just, at the NYU Game Center, like we have classes that are sort of, more, I guess, like more theory-based or more studies-esque and then more development-esque, but then there's these sort of like mixed classes in the middle, and the vast majority of our classes are just that. And it's like a very permeable kind of, grouping, which I think that's just like a really natural way to operate in games, honestly. Like I can't see any other way of being.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing in the studies frame, because of course theory encompasses things like history and historiography. I have like Chris and Kent's voices in my head. I'm like, oh, it's not just theory. And I know a lot of you all teach that, not just the history of video games, but history and historiography and the way that it informs or doesn't inform video games. But I'll ask, and this is still going to be a version of the same question, but just to layer on a word that I've heard from a lot of you so far is like the word experimental. And I think this is a tricky word, right? Because it could be very hand-wavy in the art world, like, oh, this is experimental, it's a little different. Oftentimes that means either formal experimentation or socio-political experimentation, but there's also this resonance with the sciences, right? Like the idea of hypothesis testing. And I don't mean this in like a flat positivist sort of way. I mean like games are sometimes working out hypotheses to which we do not know the answer. And in a way that is a different form of research, right? It isn't like writing about something, it's like using the game as a tool, a technique, or a mode of thought in itself. And critics do this and game makers do this as well. And so I wonder if that word experiment and all of its complexities and all of its dark and promising histories alike can help us think about this theory practice question.
I can try. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about experimentation, the use of the word. I think it carries a lot of cultural capital in certain places, and I think that's part of it's part of the issues with it. I think for me, so I don't know if I can tie this to theory and practice so much, but I think my definition of experimentation, or the way I try to kind of redefine it, is by not, this sounds very like cagey and sneaky, but I think by not defining, like people always want to write, like, what does your lab do? Can you write that like one blurb paragraph? What are the things this lab does, And I'm always like, I don't want to write anything. I don't want to say that it does anything, because I think that starts to erode my vision around experimentation, is once I start to define that. Like, I want it to be very reactive to the moment, have different kinds of durations, have levels of failure and success that are undefined, be highly technological and highly skeptical and non-technological, sometimes theoretical, sometimes not. So I think it is like, it's a very like cagey answer, because I feel like to preserve what that means, like you don't want to start calling anything, and I even have a hard time, like I don't want to use that word. I just want to be like, well, here's a collection of things that got made. We have like, just, in the game lab, we have like about 300 projects listed that you can see on the lab's page. And they're all kind of different, and that's kind of a corpus of experimentation. Some have become commercially really viable, like million-dollar games, and some are like, immediately thrown in the trash. But I think that's kind of what I like about it, and again, I think academia allows that to happen. And I would say, you said that experimentation in the arts is prevalent or used, but I find it not that much, actually. It doesn't even have that much currency in some of the art environments that like I overlap with. Like in the contemporary art world, capital A, I don't think experimentation has much currency, actually. Other things do. Experimental art there is seen almost as unsuccessful in the contemporary art space because it's experimental. And then I think in other disciplines it might have, like in theater you think of experimental, like, okay, this is now both has, prestige and success at the same time. So, yeah.
Fox, but I want to add something.
Okay, sure. So in terms of theory and practice, I'll just say the way that I came about theory was not from my first exposure through academia, but that was just through life experience. So I looked at theory as something that if it's good theory, it should help me somehow within life. And so I can start this way to say that my parents both, my father studied sociology and education. My mom studied sociology and art. But I wouldn't say that they're some kind of traditional academics. In fact, they both came from Pittsburgh. Well, they're not academics at all, really, but they both came from Pittsburgh. If people know Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there's a neighborhood, Hill District and Homewood, such Point Breeze. And yeah, I would say about it, like my dad put it this way before he passed away, as he looked back at his life. He's like, not bad for a ghetto guy, is the way that he would think about his life. Because he went to college. I mean, he was, my mom was honor student, but at that generation, she wasn't suggested like, oh, you should go to college. It was like, you start a family and that's it. And then my dad was, a basketball star, so he went to college on scholarships. And I mean, he was like at summer tryouts for the Utah Jazz before someone stepped on his foot while he was jumping and his kneecap popped off. So, so he took his, like the other route. He's like, okay, I'm gonna go to college. I have a, I'm gonna focus on this. I have a family, and turns out that all the things people said about intelligence and just being athlete, all those things were not true, because he was stellar at sociology and then ended up getting offered scholarship to take, for a PhD program in sociology, undergrad, graduated summa cum laude. And so there was all of these things that he's told, if you're not this, but actually really excelled. And that was, I think, coming from the way of looking at things in life. So sometimes when I was growing up, I would, he'd talk about being a free thinker and then tell me about like intellectual anarchy. And it turns out that there's a book called Against Methods that, he was like actually, taking and quoting from, or talking about stigma. And then it's like later on, I'm like, okay, that's like a lot like Irving Goffman's work. And so when I first encountered cultural theory and feminist theory, gender theory in college, it was like, oh, these are words for all the things my dad was teaching me growing up. And so theory was something more just kind of like, oh yeah, I can explain it in a particular kind of way, but these are things that impacted me in everyday life. And I remember, I always have a lot of gratitude for this professor. He's still at Carnegie Mellon, Andrew Johnson. He was a TA, a grad student at that time. And being in the art library, reading Judith Butler or some like gender theory. And at that time, like 18 years old, I was like, okay, what are people gonna think? Just like reading gender theory. And like he just said like, oh, what's that you're reading? Oh, Judith Butler, gender theory. Like I read some of that myself. And again, it felt like this is just part of like everyday life and like being really affirmed. It's like for trying to understand things about the world, like who you are, like how you interact with people. So for me, like I can read a lot of different types of theory. Some of it gets really jargony, some of it's not, some of it's really clear. But for me, that's not really the point. It's more like, does this give me some purchase into something like in everyday life and for understanding what I do? Like if there's a kind of game that I'm interested in and then I learn about nonlinearity, like is that quite right? And then like Celia mentioned Espen Arseth was on there, and like, oh well, cybertext, that book gives a way to think about nonlinearity that's different than just like nonlinearity in fiction, and so then there's some terminology to talk about what that means in terms of games. So it's like a lot of times it comes for me from utility, and maybe from the other side, sometimes people just see the language and so forth, that's, oh, this is theory, or it's like, it could have some jargon or specialized terms, but usually it's coming from some specific need to express or understand something, and that's why I tend to bring theory into the work. In terms of experimentation, the first thing it made me think of was coming out of that program at NYU. I worked for a little while as interactive TV producer, this at Oxygen Media, so Oxygen TV, the cable network. At the beginning they were like, we're gonna be the anti-Lifetime. We're going to be like this radical, there's a show called Liquid Television that was on MTV that was like really experimental, and they're like, we're gonna be like, like that oriented towards women. And so like I got hired like to do that kind of work, and we produced work that was shown it was like shown on TV, but as well as on the web, and creating new forms of like interactive stories and this sort of thing. And I worked as a game developer for a little bit, and I enjoyed it, but I felt like 10% of the time, maybe. I was coming up with like a lot of really creative ideas, and then a lot of the other time was like making the deals and like pitching things, and like there was just like a lot of other things that we were doing. I went to a conference called Narrative Intelligence. It was a Association for Advancement of AI conference in 1999, and some of the kinds of people Celia mentioned were there, like doing work in like VR and AI and art, like these sort of things. And I just thought, like, this is really cool work. Some of these people I knew from when I was undergrad, and it's like, I could be, like, every day I could be doing the kind of things I was doing as an undergrad, like going from machine learning class to like digital movies class, and like kind of not being, there's different pressures I know now, like in academia too, but at that point I was like, all right, it's not going to be about shipping the product at the end. There's a lot of other things, you know, I could focus in. So that kind of like pushed me towards, you could say, like wanting to experiment in a different way than I could in industry. I mean, each one has its trade-offs, but the idea that I would have different pressures besides the commercial pressures to do this kind of work at the intersection of AI, technology, storytelling, games, you know, like that was a big part of why I was interested in going into academia.
This is such a rich conversation. We have like 20-ish minutes, and I want to make sure to get to audience stuff. So maybe let's take one or two more quick comments, and then we'll do one more question. And
yeah, I wanted to
audience.
add to the experimental conversation, because one of the things I do a lot is sort of interdisciplinary consciousness raising, for lack of a better term. And that experimental is a classic. I will introduce a lot of words that mean different things in different disciplines. So like a classic one is theory, which is totally different things in different disciplines. Another one is model. And experimental is another word that like it has a completely different meaning depending on what discipline you're in. The class I'm teaching now, the one where I use Yoko Ono and Fluxus and Dada Art to teach game design, what I focus on there is affordance-based experimentation with media. So that's where the Man Ray conversation came up, was, you know, he was experimenting with the film medium and seeing all the different things it could do besides being inside of a camera. And so that's one type of experimentation, but then there are also scientific types of experimentation. There was the R&D that I did coming up in game design in the 80s, which was we had no idea what we were doing and we just had to try shit until something worked. You know, so there's a lot of different breadth of what, to me, what that means, and we just should be clear about which type of experimentation we're focusing on in a given conversation.
I just want to give a really concrete example of a conversation I had with some of my MFA students last week, because so one of the things that we do, and like the ways that I certainly teach, like when you're sort of ideating a new project, is think about your creative challenge statement. Like, what is the creative challenge you're trying to solve for this particular game or project you're going to embark on? And so, you know, that's like a framing that I get students to work on. And sometimes, you know, students will come with an idea or something they've been percolating on or something they've been working on, and they're trying to talk about it. So last week I had a couple of our master's students, MFA students, come to my office to talk to me about a project, and they sort of like dove right in and got into like the nitty-gritty of some stuff, and I was like, okay, like let's step back and think about what your creative challenge statement is for this. And they were like, you know, and they took the feedback, etc. And then at one point in the conversation, they were like, oh, what, you know, at what point do we need to be able to do this? And I was like, what? At what point do we need to be able to like sell our work, or like sell, you know, do it in this like sales pitch way? And I was like, this is not about a sales pitch. This is like about how do you talk about the work you're doing? Like this is what you're here to do, is to learn about how to talk about your work and what does your work mean, and what does it sort of embody. So I just wanted to give that as like a specific example of like that intertwinedness of sort of theory and practice that we were talking about, and experimentation.
I'll just jump in real quick, and then I know we want to get to the audience. What was I going to say? I'm the theorist, I think, on the panel, and the way I approach experimentation, especially in video games, one of the things that I try to think about in the new book, but in general, is that there's always an Indian almost in any kind of context, and the work of theory is, the problem of theory really is the problem of its relationship to Indians, to indigenous peoples. Structures come out of anthropology, All of the things that we think about in relationship to code, to all these concepts come from a certain way of ordering the world that's tied to settler colonialism. So part of the work for me of theory as a theorist is to actually figure out what the problem is. And that could be in a form of experimentation, but in video games, often they're just Columbusing, which is the word I like to use to talk about how video games are essentially giving us the new world over and over and over and over for us to kind of deal with. And I'm sort of excited at the possibility that we might get something other in a video game someday that isn't just colonization.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question before we get to the audience, which we may have to do out loud unless people still have the URLs. I realize I didn't have the code here, but we'll see. Zach, are you getting questions?
Yeah, we have a couple. We
Okay.
can take more, but they're also media.
Okay, great. So my question is, I'm looking out here, right? I'm seeing like a lot of undergraduates whom I would love to see on this panel in like 5 or 10 years, and a great part of what we do, obviously, is the research, as Eddo was saying. Like that is a unique thing about the university compared to most other institutions. But also, a big part of what we do is teaching undergraduate students and building community across generations. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how you approach teaching games. Again, something that may seem like perverse to Fox News, but not to most of the world, including probably much of their viewership. But how do you approach any of the kind of knotty tensions, complications, or affordances of bringing video games into the classroom?
I'd love to talk about the class I'm teaching next semester, which is designing imaginary worlds. And the reason I wanted to start with that is because the day that I start the class, I always tell the students, you know more about imaginary worlds than I do. But I know other things that are going to help you think about how to make better ones. And so a lot of what happens in the class is them teaching me and each other about all the different worlds that they love, but also thinking more critically again about, I love that you brought up colonialism. I mean, it's a trope in video games forever, right? And in board games as well, in fact. So in this class, one of the things that's frustrating me right now from, again, an academic perspective is I'm using this great book by Mark Wolf called Building Imaginary Worlds, but it's completely Tolkien and Euro-centered, and it just infuriates me because currently my students, the majority of them are not white. It infuriated me before, but now that I don't have a majority of white students anymore, I'm like, this is not working for me, and I need to figure out, do I need to write that book, or is somebody else writing it? Because, again, to think critically and not just keep, I want them to not just keep regurgitating the mass media, pablum that they keep getting fed by, frankly, capitalism. So they can think beyond those tropes and through their own cultural lens and through their own experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question, how to teach games. I mean, I think, I guess what I privilege, maybe, I'm trying to reduce this, I teach a lot of different kinds of classes. I teach very technical classes and theory classes, literacy classes, and game design, tangible. But I guess the framework I usually bring is craft is at the core of how I see this medium. I think it's an artistic medium, and it has at its core, I think, craft. I think we saw KRZ yesterday. That is a beautifully crafted work, and that resonates, and I think that's really important to me. The kind of potential of this medium to me lies in craft, in that time, that collaboration sometimes, but the craft. So I think I'm really heavily invested in craft, try to hire people who have deep, deep craft. And then the other is literacy, I guess, more than theory, maybe, the way I like to think of it. So theory coming mostly through game analysis and I guess case study, play a lot of games if you don't already, a lot of different kinds of games, and think about what those experiences are, write about it, talk about it, think about it. But I think that's kind of my, the way I approach it. But also, technology, like like you used video games also when you said, so I always stop when I hear that because I teach a lot of non-video game stuff. And I think everyone knows this. I think I probably learned this intuitively from others, but when I started teaching game design as one of my classes, I knew already that it should not be a technical class, because then you get caught up in other stuff. And I think that craft needs its isolation. So, and the same, we have a wonderful person like Jenna Caravillo, my colleague. She's an amazing animator and painter and artist, and she teaches world building, but it's all deep craft. So that class is all about, that stuff. So I think that maybe is a simple thing, a simple way that I look at this, not to forget that. And the coding is craft too, and writing is craft, and music is craft, as everything.
Yeah, with the analog techniques, I always tell my students, if you are going to be an animator, you have to learn how to draw first. So that's why we don't use computers in our intro-game class.
That's probably true of everybody, of most people here. Is that fair to say? Yeah.
Sort of the standard now, I think.
Any other thoughts about teaching?
So there are a couple of things I do in teaching in general, including in games, about games. So one of them is created from Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is it's like horizontal learning, generative themes. It's like it should engage what people are interested in. So the way I set up my classes, usually I teach pretty much always 3-hour classes. I have a little break in the middle, and for about half of it, students are at the front of the room, and so they read the thing, like read something I've assigned, played some games that I've assigned, and then their task is to take something that they're really interested in, especially if there are a few examples, but something they really care about, and then use those readings, use some ideas to illuminate something you care about in what your topic is. And so a student might be interested in some particular form of activist games around an issue that they're interested in, or it could be like anti-colonialism. It could be whatever that topic is, and then just find some way to connect our themes to provide a lens on what you do. But they're not on their own, so there's a lot of work behind the scenes. So they send me something maybe 4 to 5 days ahead of class, which is like a write-up and outline, and then I give a huge amount of notes, ideas, structure. Here's how you might want to think about organizing it, really taking from what they've done, and then they take that, they integrate it, and then they're up front. And then a lot of times they might go along and they'll say, hey, let's pause here for a while, and then go up to the board, add some idea. They're like, okay, let's go back to it. And so it's kind of improvised, but it's make sure all the pedagogical points come out. If they're not in that lecture, then I might stand up and say something, ask questions, but it's really driven by their own examples, and I end up learning a huge amount every time too, because I come with a list of works that I might not have known even I try to keep up with things, but still, it's they don't know everything that each other are interested in. I don't know either, and so that's always great, because then it's reading this. It's like lifelong learning just based in the structure. And then the second half, I'll do something have some activities, share some kind of work, whether it's debate, small group, critique sessions, and so forth. And the other thing is it's always quite interdisciplinary. So in the syllabus, they have readings, and I'll pair, say, a reading in cognitive science and a reading in cultural studies, a reading from human-computer interaction, say design, and then a reading from feminist studies. And then I won't only just pair them, I'll give some sense of what are the values behind them, and how might you want to read them? Because you might say, is this one, Simon Penny has an article, he's at Irvine, about agents as artworks, and he talks about some fields value generalizability, some fields value the individual experience of a work. And so I'll try to give them some ideas about think about what are the values that are underlying this. Because if you look at this art paper and then you judge it based on is that artwork generalizable? It's not going to be that interesting. And same thing, you look at an example is when I did my PhD dissertation defense, it was in a computer science and engineering department, And a cognitive scientist looked at some digital work and then said, like, you know, this is pretty interesting, but what's really interesting is the array of cognitive functions that are engaged at the same time as this is happening. You know, because he's a cognitive scientist, you know, that's what he's interested in. You know, but it's like maybe he missed some things about like the experience or about the like design or the system architecture. You know, so it's like I try to help people to say, like, yeah, you can be critical of works, but also try to understand like what are the values of the author, and then you might also get something of benefit from the work. So I try to give a lot of guidance in the syllabus itself about not only which disciplines are coming from, what are the values of the discipline, and then pair different disciplines so they can read them against each other.
I want to also add to that, like, what are the values that you have as an educator, and what are you trying to get your students to do? So I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I felt like I jumped in there. But yeah, I just want to point to, you know, recently, and I see Steele is in the room. Hey, Steele. Shout out, Steele. So some of our students actually wanted to do a sort of pedagogy of game design independent study. So we sort of looked at, like, okay, what is the reason so they all did these like presentations around sort of like what their philosophy of teaching would be. And, you know, and myself and like Eric Zimmerman was sort of co-teaching as well. So we did one of those ourselves as well. And, you know, this is something like I always revisit anyway periodically, because sometimes you have to for like the paperwork of academic reviews is you write your little personal statement. But yeah, like, you know, for me, the sort of how do I teach games? It's craft, like Eddo said, but it's also like, what am I trying to get these students to do? And what is like, and how does that pair with my vision of like why I'm doing this work? And for me, it's because I'm trying to sort of push games forward, bring in other voices, get people to sort of their artistic voice and help them find it. So, you know, what are the methods that you need to get to that? But yeah, I just wanted to sort of add that.
I go really fast. I know we're getting kind of out of time. I approach this video games in my class trying to do a kind of narrative analysis and cultural analysis, because that's what I do. And I come through Indigenous studies. And one of the kind of principles in Indigenous studies at this point is the way in which we relate to land. So there's work by Leanne Simpson about land as pedagogy. So it becomes a way of asking students to actually have to think spatially about what land does for us as its own like way of orienting to space. And I see a student from my class. So you know, and then Indigenous culture is also really good at storytelling, and that's been one of the places that a lot of people want to see an intersection between video games and digital culture, and what's possible for Indigenous storytelling to manifest maybe fully in its oral tradition. I mean, even Janet Murray brings in bardic traditions as part of the coding technologies. So, you know, it's kind of a spiraling around a problem, which is that video games give a certain kind of relationship to land, and how can we imagine that relationship differently if we actually thought about land through Indigenous pedagogy.
Thank you. So we might run a couple of minutes over. If anybody needs to leave early, though, let me know. I know there are flights and things like that. But let's at least start with one question. We'll maybe do one or two and then move forward. So Zach, if you can share one with us, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think given that a lot of the focus of the panel and many of your careers is around this kind of relationship between theory and practice and the role of practice in your teaching and in your research, there were a couple questions around the role of the theorist practitioner within game studies, noting it seems more common in this field than in other art studies perhaps that instructors have experience creating the media they study in industry, in academia, or both. How have the standards and expectations for a theorist practitioner as a professional academic role changed or formalized over time? And then, do you think of your own role as academics as trying to train the next generation of game scholars and researchers, or equipping students with skills and experiences that would allow them to succeed outside of, or perhaps more polemically, escape academia?
So there's a kind of an old adage that I really like that very much applies to academia, which is when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I think that, one of the issues in academia is that whoever is doing it thinks it's their thing and their way of doing it is the right way to do it, right? So, but the thing about game design is that it's an interdiscipline by definition. It's one of the few areas, even in creative work, where it's full. I mean, film is very interdisciplinary, but games is like an order of magnitude more interdisciplinary. And so there is a push in one direction, as I mentioned, like when I was at USC and critical studies is over here and production is over here and nary the twain shall meet. I rejected that immediately, and there has been a group of game scholars over the last 30 years or however long I've been doing this stuff that have resisted that bifurcation of the critical and the making. And I've even been in places where I've left because the politics have swung away from that integrated aspect. But I would encourage everybody to be very, not to disregard a person who just does that, but that practitioners should be taking your classes, right? So there needs to be, I think it's very important to be staunchly interdisciplinary and not allow that bifurcation, because I think it makes better scholars and better game designers if they have a fully interdisciplinary approach.
I'll just jump in to say Indigenous studies is incredibly interdisciplinary as a field, in the ways it requires us to be able to speak across politics, culture, everything. I mean, it's like, and it's part of what makes it so hard to kind of codify what a discipline is in academia generally. So that's another place where I feel like video game studies and design and Indigenous studies have these interesting overlaps.
You do?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this question a lot because I guess for me, I do, like, I value interdisciplinarity. I am one of those people, and I agree the field is so interdisciplinary. On the other hand, I don't know, I like to kind of stop a little bit myself, because I think to sort of be also truthful to the idea of deep craft and expertise, I think there's something also less good about hybridity in this case. I think sometimes people who are like very good at one thing and then they do another thing, they project like, well, I can do all this stuff well, look at how good I am at this, so I become, and I think that does dilute, I think, a lot of the quality, from my perspective, in the education around games is actually the interdisciplinarity, where you have people who I think don't have deep craft or deep understanding of one element teaching that element. So like, I'm okay at teaching theory, but I don't know if I'm the best person to do it, you know, but there's not enough people yet to do it. So I'm a little bit also like an advocate of the opposite, because I think one way to structure a games program that makes tons of sense is kind of the opposite. It's like, well, find your computer scientists who have an interest in games, be in dialogue with them, let them go deep. Find your animators, artists, architects, musicians, let them do their thing and be in dialogue with them. Find your theorists, find your systems design, you know, all this stuff, and then have them together working rather than having people kind of be these efficient, like Swiss Army knives to kind of fit multitask. So I'm always a little on the fence on how good that is. And again, in the arts, anyone who's in like the fine arts, there's a lot of controversy around the hybrid PhD. I think this is kind of taking over academia, people getting PhDs in art who over-theorize, don't have experience making art in the world, and they're going straight from a PhD program into academia teaching artists. And they've never had a show in their life, but they've been in school for 15 to 20 years and running job searches nonstop. I see 80% of our applicant pools are people with PhDs ready to go to academia. And not that there's great people there, I'm not saying that, but it's actually really important to bring other people in. Like, I can tell you, I have seen a handful of NYU and USC student applicants with MFAs apply for our positions, literally less than 5 out of about 300. And I was like, where are these? These are people who have deep craft and could teach, but they're like somehow not on the academic track. So I think there's a problem here?
So I think that segues nicely to, because I wanted to answer that second part of the question, which is like, why get a games undergrad degree, right? And certainly, and I know sort of there's a lot of undergrads, et cetera, here. It's interesting. I feel like it just in the 10 years that I've been at the NYU Game Center and seeing sort of what our grad students are wanting to do and our graduates are wanting to do, there has been more of a shift that I've noticed. First, I mean, two things I'll say. Firstly, the point of like getting like our kind of game design undergrad degree is not to necessarily get a job in industry. I know that's like a really like tough point to, there's like what the university says, and then there's like what we can say as a department. And, you know, we've all had to do this. We've all just had to talk about like statistics and percentages of our undergrads who've graduated and gone into industry jobs and that kind of thing. But that is not the point of a games education, right? And I think Brendan Keogh writes about this really well, which is, you know, likening it more. He wrote this really great piece a few years back where he likened it to more like getting a degree in like poetry or something, right? You're not getting a job to go out and be a poet and make money. You're like, you're educating yourself in a form of thinking primarily, right? So like, that's one thing I'll say. The other thing I'll say is that I have noticed this shift into more and more people are wanting to become games educators themselves, right? And games academics themselves. I mentioned Steele and their cohort running this, independent study to want to become, games academics, which I think is awesome, and it's really great to see that shift because there's another path that's open to people around like, how do you be in games? Like, how do you exist in this space and contribute artistically to this space? So I think that's a good thing. Sometimes I sort of start feeling like, is this a little bit Ouroboros-like? But, you know, I don't think it has to be, right? I don't think it has to be.
And so the question included, like, what are my aims for the students? Do I want them to go into industry or be scholars? I mean, really, it's like what they want to do. It's like, I'd like to empower that. And some, they also switch at different times. Some say, I really want to go to industry, and then later on they want to go into academia or vice versa. And sometimes at different universities, there might be pressures like that people have values. Like if we have more students who are in industry, or a lot of times for me, especially computer science and AI lab, because in AI, a lot of these students, like the PhD students, they could just go off and find very lucrative jobs in Silicon Valley. And so when they choose to become professors, people look at it like, oh, that's, like they took, some other professors look at it as like, oh, they took like the good path or something, like this. But it's like, to me, it's like I've had students go into industry and say, hey, look, I made this particular impact in a AAA game title, and you remember we talked about that in your class, and so it's like, really, it's like, okay, whatever they want to do, that's what I would like to try to, empower. And then I do think it's an interesting question about, disciplinarity. I mean, for myself, I always try, let's say this way, people ask me so many times, like, you must be in the MIT Media Lab, right? I'm like, no, I'm in the Computer Science and AI Lab. I'm also in Comparative Media Studies, which is in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. I'm at the two extremes, like maybe Media Lab is somewhere in between, and it's because of, like you mentioned, 3 degrees. It's like I did my Bachelor's of Science and my Bachelor's of Fine Arts, and I went to Tisch School of the Arts for terminal masters, and I went to Computer Science and Engineering degree for a PhD. So trying to get really solid in each area, but I also don't think that that's the only path. And so when I look at students, I see sometimes, and when I admit them, I like to have ones that have some multiple experiences. Let's say they could be a computer science major and a sociology minor, or like vice versa, or double major, or just a concentration in one. But I'd like for them to at least have exposure to multiple areas. But some of them are just really good, say, visual or interaction designers. Some are really good theorists. Some of them can run experiments, and that's great. I mean, they work really well in teams. But I also have some students who create really wonderful theses and dissertations, and they might not be the best at any one particular aspect of like design or theory, but they're very original thinkers, and sometimes come out with like a really interesting dissertation. So I don't really look at it as kind of like it's better or worse to be really highly disciplinary or interdisciplinary. Each of them tend to have their own advantages, and sometimes they just have talent in multiple areas. But I just try to look at each one and say, like, there's something really valuable in each of those kind of approaches. And if, let's say, they're not the best at programming, or they're not the best at like the graphic design. I would say, but there's ways to handle that, because you can, like, there's a comic called Bean World. I don't know if anyone knows this, but it's just characters, it's like little beans, like lines coming from them, but it's like very coherent. It sticks within that range like every time, and it doesn't try to do more, and it like works because they understand like the author has limitations in that realm, but they also have the taste to work with them. And so I also feel like for people who might not be the best at every single element, there are ways, like just through your taste and your vision, that you can create really compelling works.
I just want to add one thing here that you kind of alluded to, is that out in the real world, very few people are going to make a game by themselves. Eddo is kind of a notable exception of a person who can do that, but there's not that many. You could probably do it too. There are very few people who can do that. What you really need to know how to do to succeed is to communicate with people in other disciplines. To me, that is the thing that I know how to do really well is I'm a coder whisperer. Like, I can talk to programmers. I can't program a single line of code, but I know how to communicate with people who do. And this is something we teach and we grade in our program, is like, if you can't communicate with your fellow collaborators, you're doomed. So that, to me, and I think that's underdone, because academia is so much about you get an A, I get a B, you get a C. Like, no, that's not anywhere. There's nowhere else in the world where you get ranked by yourself in absence of anyone else. Only in academia for some bizarre reason. So I think that's a super important thing that we need to make sure is part of the discussion.
Great. Yes. So on that note, we're not going to end yet. This is a games conference. We have to end with a game. It's not going to be an original game if you were here for the Challenging Play conference, the Challenging Play panel, but we're going to do a variation of it. I think this will be extra hard with academics, and I mean that lovingly. I include myself in this. So, like, I teach games now, but I started in English. I'm not going to make you do iambic pentameter. That would be cruel and unusual. But we will ask one more question from Zach. This will be a complex question. It'll be unanswerable in 10 words, but you will have 10 words or fewer to answer this question. We need a little game. We need a little flourish of joy, playfulness, and perhaps a little failure. Like, if you stop mid-sentence, that's okay too. Like, ellipses are allowed. They don't count for your 10 words. So anyway, let's ask a complex question and see what happens.
Perfect, thank you. So we got a couple questions alluding to different negative aspects of being a games academic. Things ranging from frustration about the inheritance of commercial categories and language for talking about games, to dealing with the nitty-gritty of having to put learning objectives in all your classes. How do you manage the downsides of your work?
I'm so sorry, please don't hate me. But in any order, and you don't have to play. I mean, play involves consent, right? I mean, so it has to be voluntary in some way. But if anybody has 10 words or fewer on that very complex question, I would love to hear it. Do you want to do? Yeah.
Do what you want to do.
Wow.
So when not dealing with academia and games, playing Doomgaze bass in my basement.
Fox's poetry background comes in.
I would say the ability to fail and have stability, but who knows?
A question, extra points.
I have a short one, which is swing dancing and dog walking.
We're here to break things.
That is a wonderful note with which to end, and I'm going to focus on the we rather than the break, even though I like the break so much more. And I kind of just want to stress like how important community is to what we do. Like, this obsession with games, on the one hand, is like huge. It's transnational. It's enormous, but within academia, it's like pretty small and still growing, I think, in many ways. And I think when you look at things like the rankings of universities, it seems like everybody is competing with everyone, right? That paradigm of competition within games. But we also have cooperative games. And I think the people on this panel and at other universities, like, we try to cooperate with one another. It's a small but vibrant world. So I want to, again, thank these panelists for being part of our community, too. I'd also like to thank all of the guests, several of whom are with us still today, for just the wonderful conversations across the entire weekend. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for organizing this to everyone who organized.
Absolutely. Two more categories of things. I want to thank the libraries at the University of Chicago. I mean, without the work of Torsten, Patty, and several other people, this just would not happen. It's this effort. It's also the entire year of games. So thank you for your vision and for your generosity with this. And finally, I again want to thank the four people who put the most time and work into this. And I'll just go one by one really briefly. Most of you know these people very, very well because they support you on a daily basis in addition to something like this. First, no particular order. First, I just want to, and stand up or something if you're in the room, hopefully. Kent Lambert, first of all. For the academics in the room, of course, you've read things in like infrastructure studies. There's so much like infrastructure and logistics and invisible stuff that like runs the things that we're able to do on a daily basis. Believe me, you would not be able to do anything you do in your classes related to media arts if it wasn't for Kent and Kate and folks who are supporting us at the MAD Center. So thank you for everything. Second of all, Francis Lee, who's back there. Many of us here have worked together for many, many years. Francis joined us specifically for this year of games and has been the project coordinator and has just been amazing in terms of like noting details, telling us what to do in the best possible way. I love being told what to do and just making sure that everything in this event ran on time. So thank you again, Francis. Over here we have Ashlyn Sparrow. And Ashlyn has been building community at this university around games and many other things for, what, like 12 years now in many, many different roles. I mean, Ashlyn's here often till like 8 p.m., 10 p.m., playing board games with students, with faculty, getting us all obsessed with things we wouldn't otherwise know about, and teaching our courses, working on research projects, making games with students. So thank you for all the work that you do too. And last but not least, Chris Carloy. Chris is a wonderful historian, as I've said many times during this, like teaches these decade-specific courses, teaches a course on Sonic through transmedia, works with our MA students in a way that has brought the study of games like from the undergrad level to the MA and PhD level. In fact, was one of our first PhD students working on a dissertation in this area, but has now been an instructor and has been a leader of the entire year of games effort in the steering committee. I'm very messy. Chris is not. He's detail-oriented. He's meticulous. He doesn't miss stuff. This really would fall apart without him. So thank you so much, Chris. Now I just like invite you to hang out, talk to people, make connections, not necessarily network. I don't love that verb. Like build community, collaborate, whatever you want. But thank you all for joining us for the entire weekend.
Thank you, Patrick.